Hello, this is Minter Chen. I'm a professor of Management Information System at Smith School of Business and Economics at California State University, Channel Island. This is the second lecture on Introduction to Management. Last time we introduced a definition of what is management and also describe various functions performed by managers. And this POLC framework classify management function into planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. And the variety of activity performed by managers which can be classified under this four category as listed here in this table. And last time we mentioned that when we try to study various management function, we can take certainly the people's perspective, which is very important because by definition, management is really try to get things done through other people. So understand people who you need to work with, you need to manage is very important. However, there are other approach in understand the management function, including system thinking, process orientation, and the resource view approach in understand how things work. So in this lecture, I'm going to just cover the system thinking, process orientation, and resource view. And this is the simplest kind of system diagram. A system has input and output. The input may receive from the environment, and when you go through the system, which would transform the input, add value to it, and generate output, which would send back to the environment. And the system is a dynamic one, it's an open one, it's an organic system, it evolves just like an organization. And the system will perform the function of transformation that can be viewed as a process. And when you try to define a system, it's very important to clarify and identify its boundary, where you draw the line and between the system and the environment. I'm going to introduce a few more system model which add additional element to the simple system model. In this version, clearly we have input, we process the input, and we generate the output. And when we generate the output, a lot of time we will assess the output and which allowed us to provide feedback actually to in terms of what input maybe we should receiving, and the feedback certainly can help us to improve the processing activity in the system. I also added the storage element. A lot of time when you receive the input for processing, and you may not have the capacity to do it right away, then you need to have some kind of storage mechanism to store the receiving material or even data, and for later processing. And so it could be, storage can be in the form of inventory or database. In this diagram, I added another element, which is goal. A system, any system has some goal which can be clearly defined or can be very fuzzy. And one reason having a goal-oriented system in our description is that we can compare the output, the outcome, with the goal which has been defined to see whether the system has achieved the objective we set up front. And the comparison between the output and the desirable outcome and the goal would help us to generate the feedback which we can use to adjust the input and the process of the system to ensure we will meet the goal through a continuous improvement process. This is probably a more complicated version. And once again, it's very important you understand the system's boundaries, which help you to clarify the system and its environment. The input, you need to study actually where the input may be coming from, who are the provider of the input or resource that you need to perform your function. And the input could be some triggering event that triggered certain activity to get started. And the output certainly will go and consumed by other entity in the environment, which could be a consumer, some user, or within the organization could be some other organization unit within the firm. And I added another component called control, which means we need to constantly monitoring the input process output to ensure they live up to the standard and expectation. And also another element is a mechanism. Mechanism is closely related to process, sometimes considered part of the process. The mechanism could be policy, procedure, or work method, which allowed us to follow the mechanism or use the mechanism to get things done in performing the process. So that kind of concludes the system aspect of looking at management. And another popular way to look at management is through a process view, a process approach. Edward Deming, which is considered the father of quality movement, has a Deming circle, which is also called PDCI's cycle, and it is used for continuous quality control and improvement effort. Let's look at first of all the PDCA cycle. We started usually from planning, and once we have the plan, we will perform the activity based on the plan, and here we call it do. And sometimes, and once you have done it, then we would check the result to see whether it conforms to some quality standard or to our goal. And if there's some discrepancy, then the act here is really a corrected effort, try to correct mistakes, error, and lack of quality, and improve sometimes the plan or how we do things, and such that we can move along this line to improve our maturity in the quality improvement process. So this plan, do, check, and act, it's a cycle that we're constantly going through the cycle. So there's a feedback loop allowed us to make improvement, and eventually we can produce high quality work product to be delivered to our customers. Okay, and this approach is really conform to the project management concept in terms of planning, executing, monitoring, and control. Here, plan mapped to the planning. Executing is really referred to do, and monitoring, controlling is really the check and involve also the corrective actions. Another thing which worth mentioning is what we call triple constraint of project management or of any management effort. We don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited resources. So when you try to tackle a management problem or issue, you need to keep in mind that time and cost or resources are two major constraints, and the constraint will limit you in terms of the scope of your effort and project. And quality, I put quality here because if you need the high quality work, that probably need more time and resources. So quality and scope actually affect the requirement for time, resource, and other type of resources. And time, eventually, in terms of planning, will end up to be the schedule, your schedule in how you would pursue an initiative and how to plan and get it implemented. And the resources availability and eventually will turn to the cost for the effort. And these three constraints are kind of depend on each other. They're kind of related to each other. And when you change your scope, you may need more resources and more time in order to get things done. In project management, they classify a lot of project management activity into 5 process groups and also 9 knowledge management area. And let's start from the center, which we have seen this planning, executing, monitoring, control. There's 2 more group added is initiating a project, an effort, and also at the end is closing it down, which like summarize the lesson learned and make sure that everything has been documented properly, and then assign the project member maybe to other initiatives and project. That's the closing side. And the 9 knowledge management area, we're not going to go through all of them, but from the 3, the triple constraint that we had mentioned just in the previous slide, time management is one, related to that, cost management. And cost, one of the major factor in terms of cost is certainly the personnel cost. Therefore, human resource management is very important. The scope and quality, one of the triple constraint is listed here. So managing the scope. Scope is really related to systems approach regarding the boundary, part of the boundary or the output that you plan to deliver. And quality is part of the measure in terms of your output. And another factor is the risk, which is not one of the triple constraint, but it's an important one. We always need to watch out for the potential risk factor and figure out a way to mitigate the potential risk. To acquire resources, we need procurement management. And since there's a lot of people involved in the project internally or dealing with stakeholder externally, communication management become important. And all of that need to be integrated. So integration management has become another management area that we need to pay attention to. So let's look at just a little bit more detailed kind of what we call the process modeling. Once again, this is a simple one. We have a process or function in the middle, and there's input always in this. By the way, this graphical notation is called IDEF0. It's a standard. And the input always coming from the left, the output going to the right. And what's useful here is that from the top, there's some guideline and controlling this process. And the mechanism is referring to the resources, the information system, the technology, the tool that we may use to carry out the process. So this is how you describe a process, from not just input and output, but also considering what's the control and the mechanism. And so this is an example of using this IDEF0 notation to describe a process. And it's important that when you describe a process, you would describe what is the purpose of modeling the management activity as a process, and also what's the viewpoint, whose viewpoint that you're following, or you're taking whose viewpoint in terms of describing the process. So those are two important aspects when you try to look at a system or an organization from a process viewpoint. This is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to describe in detail, but this actually is a process decomposition diagram, which means that in the previous diagram, we have this plan new information program, but it's very high level in order to understand what has to be done when you try to carry out this process. You will zoom in and look at what's inside, and we call it process decomposition. So we kind of decompose that large process into smaller steps and break it down, and those steps may be connected to each other, like some output generated by this step 2 will be used as the input for the step 3, and eventually the last small sub-process in this diagram will generate the output, which will be received by the environment. And this allows us to describe a process at different level abstractions. It can be very useful tool, but it can be very tedious if you drill down too many levels. Last is the resource view. In business strategy, there's a resource-based view for business strategy. I'm using resource here slightly different. First of all, we did mention in our first lectures that managers are really there to manage a variety of resources, such as human resource, financial resource, and equipment, facility, or even intellectual property as part of our resource. And we need data, information, or knowledge to manage these resources. And because of that, managing the information resource, the block here, the circle here, become an important effort. So information system or using some kind of IT platform to manage data, information, or knowledge become a major management effort that you need to pay attention to. And here, I need to point out that the resource can be from internal resource. The resource can be coming from externally. And in order to manage these resources, manager need to perform various activity. Some activity can be outsourced. That's why when we say external activity, which means you can outsource certain activity to some supplier, to some partner, to help you to perform the activity. But eventually, as an organization, we will be producing, using the resource that we have, we will produce product or offer services to our customer. And this diagram is particularly try to emphasize the importance of information system, because a lot of time, if you look at manager, they rely on information to manage an organization, a business unit, and because of that, manage information system become a major technical skill that modern day professional manager need to have. We do have a course on which is MI 310, is Management Information System, which covered the information aspect of management. So to kind of summarize what we covered, let's start from the center. Basically, when you engage in a major initiative, like a marketing campaign or launching a new product whatsoever, you will ask the question like who may be involved and what resource other than human resource will be needed, which can be product, material, supply, etc. And also how to do it. That's the process part of it. And eventually when, which means the timeline, the schedule, etc. And so the people's part is human resource. That's one of the M. And people can be the market, which is our customer. The things that we need to pay attention to could be raw material, product, or the machinery that may be needed in producing the final products. The process is very important. It's more abstract, but it could be project, could be business process, business function, activity, task, and or even more abstract, it's about the work method or technique which will be used in this processes to get things done. And eventually all of this need to be measured against the goals which align to our vision, and this allowed us to ask why we're doing this. So let's look at another kind of resource perspective in looking at various activity within an organization, management activity, business activity within an organization. And this is actually a process life cycle. And when we say life cycle, it actually has a little bit of process perspective, which means that any resource, in order to manage the resource, we need to perform planning activity, plan how much resource we need, and acquiring the resource that we need of some amount and arriving at certain times so it's ready to be used. And then stewardship is really about control. Once we have the resource, we need to monitor and control its usage. And eventually, some resource may no longer need it. Then we need to figure out a way to get rid of it. That's disposal. Okay, so we start from planning the kind of resource we have, try to acquiring it, and then monitor and control the use of the resource, and eventually remove the resource when it's no longer needed. And in this process, we actually will be generating a lot of data, which allowed us to use the data and information to help us to manage, to perform this 4 different type of activity through a resource life cycle, so we can manage our resource more efficiently. So if you combine the process and resource perspective, like material resource, human resource, equipment are our resources, and educating program could be considered a resource from an HR viewpoint, a human resource viewpoint, and data can be considered resources. And the processes involved in managing these resources can be classified into, like we just described, planning, acquisition, stewardship, and disposal. So this metrics allowed us to lay out various management activity within the firms. Just as an example, material requirement planning is a planning process to help us to acquire, to plan what will be needed in terms of the material to be used for the future production effort. The acquisition of the material is the procurement functions, and monitoring the material and controlling it. That's part of warehousing and inventory control effort. And eventually, once we produce something, we need to sell it. That's considered disposal. So this is how you may use this metrics to kind of describe the 4 type of processes for different kinds of resource that an organization need to pay attention to. Last but not the least, sometimes you would hear the term called business function. Business function and management function are 2 different things, so make sure you don't confuse business function with management function. And business function is related, functions are related to the following area, like the finance department or the financial management is one business function. Managing human resources is another function. Managing information system, information technology, manage the marketing effort, manage the operation and productions, or at a very high level, as a top management, you need to manage your business strategy. The list go on, but this just kind of tell you that business functions are different than management function. And in each of the business function, you would still apply various, all the management function that we described, like planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. You still need to use all those management function in perform the business function listed here. Okay, that's it. This concludes our introduction to management.